And Helene, you're muted still.
There we go. I had to look up. Thank you, Scott, for that overview, and thank you all for joining. And thank you very much to Sunny and everyone at NAFSMA for allowing me to be part of these conversations. I really appreciate this connection, and I'm going to go through a number of slides that we could take hours. So I know Sunny's going to have the slides afterwards for participants, and I just ask that people reach out to me if they want more information. But just to introduce myself again, my name is Helene Schneider. I'm the Senior Regional Advisor for the US Interagency Council on Homelessness. Many of you are probably saying, what the heck is that? And I'll explain what that is. And what I'm going to do is really just discuss addressing people in encampments, and especially as it relates to thinking about how it relates to flood control areas and waterways and infrastructure, because there's a public safety issue, as we know, not only for the people living in encampments in the infrastructure, but compromising the infrastructure itself. I will just say right up front, just as Scott was saying about putting things in legal context, I just want to say right up front at USICH, we believe that the issue of especially of unsheltered homelessness is a tragedy and is a big issue and something that needs significant addressing on an all hands-on approach. We also think that homelessness is a systemic problem and not a personal failure. And we need to figure out how to address these systemic issues on a, like I said, an all government approach way. USICH, we've been around since the late 1980s. We've been around for a very tiny, small federal interagency. We comprise of 19 different federal departments throughout the government. So ones that you may think of like HUD or HHS or the VA, but also education, Department of the Interior, FEMA is part of this, the Social Security Administration, the Post Office, Department of Education, Department of Justice. And our job at USICH is to be what I like to call the hub of the 19-spoke wheel to keep the issue going and coordinated at the federal level. We also have a communications component, staff who bring out a lot of issues, a lot of things on emails and newsletters and resources for everyone. We have a policy team who connects with our federal partners. And then I serve as a member of the National Initiatives team. I'm one of 6 staff around the country who connect what happens at DC on a resource and information level to the local leaders. And what I think is really important is to really find out what's happening at the local level and relay that information back up to our colleagues around the country, as well as to DC. So connecting that research with reality and really trying to hear from you about what the on the ground issues are so we can address them at the federal level. Just the issue of unsheltered homelessness, HUD has not put out their 2022 point in time count numbers yet. This is something that agencies around the country are required to do for HUD to get funding related to homeless services. It's not an exact practice, but it's a consistent one around the country of looking at a snapshot, usually around January of each year, of the number of people experiencing homelessness around the United States. So the most recent documents we have that's out is the 2020 point in time count. And one of the things that we have noticed, certainly that was alarming, is that for the first time in 2020, the number of individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness exceeded the number of people experiencing sheltered homelessness. And you can see on the slide here the definitions of that. And we want to see, we will see soon what the 2022 point in time count says. We also know that there are things that can work, and there are ways that we've seen around the country that when you combine social services and housing together into what we call a housing first model and get people the services that they need and the housing in a safe place that they can put their head down at night, that things can become more sustainable over time. And that's a big part of what we do at USICH. But for this purpose here, and very briefly, because I know we have 2 other speakers, and again, please reach out to me with more information. I really want to focus on issues on what we put together, these principles on addressing encampments. And the idea here, as you have heard from Scott about the legal context, and that's giving you like how you can get around, trying to get around from getting sued or dealing with lawsuits. We really want to focus on how to solve the problem and how to work across different agencies, work across business leaders, with community groups on how, and people experiencing homelessness themselves, on figuring out solutions that are sustainable over time, as opposed to moving the problem from one place to another. And so we've created these 7 principles that we hope agencies can use to think about what can happen in your area. So this first one really, and a lot of it, as I'm going to say, is going to sound really very common sense, right? I mean, the first thing you need to do is figure out your multi-agency response. Who are all the agencies and individuals and groups who are working on this issue, who connect with people who are experiencing homelessness, who might have an encampment, for example, in a flood control area or something like that, creating that command center approach and that daily coordination. We believe that law enforcement does play a role in this, but should not be the chief point person or the chief point agency role. The street outreach components, engaging with people experiencing homelessness, getting them the services that they need, really engenders a need for establishing trust and establishing connection in a way that works. And law enforcement certainly needs to know how to interact sufficiently and effectively with people experiencing homelessness, but to come at it from an enforcement area only is not necessarily sustainable over time, and it can actually create new barriers into helping people become sustainable in their housing. The next step, looking at developing engaging residents, as I mentioned, we need to know what works by asking the people who are affected directly. I mean, keeping them as part at the table, listening to what works for them in terms of what is it that's going to help them get into whatever kind of housing or shelter services and the other types of needs that they may have. Adequate time for outreach. It takes a while sometimes to reach out to individuals in encampments to help them feel like they can and will move from an encampment into housing with services. It sometimes takes multiple connections with them to make that happen. And honoring that and addressing that, and that time is time well spent. And so really acknowledging that instead of just going, again, right into an enforcement mechanism immediately. The principle 3 is that comprehensive coordinated outreach, connecting people directly, hopefully right into housing. Understandably, as was mentioned before, there's typically not enough housing units available for people who are experiencing homelessness or in the community. We know that for people who are struggling in housing with rents going up and so forth. And certainly there are certain areas also where a number of shelter beds are also not available. So trying to figure out how to expand that supply and how to expand the connections to housing that is available, and creating new additional affordable housing and shelter opportunities and connecting them directly to those services. And this is where I think some new partnerships and expanding the way of thinking of how social service agencies and more like water district flood control agencies can work together. How can we connect better with Army Corps of Engineers, with FEMA, with flood control districts, when we're dealing with the infrastructure in mind, when it's one agency's authority to enter and exit certain areas, but needing to make those connections, for example, to a street outreach team to engage with people in encampments. Those are the kind of conversations we love to have at USICH and want to encourage throughout the country. In that next principle, addressing basic needs and storage. I mean, many reasons why sometimes someone does not want to go into a shelter or some other kind of housing opportunity is that they don't have the opportunity to store their belongings somewhere, or they're concerned that they have a pet that they can't bring along. So trying to provide public access to basic needs, other community spaces, figuring out how to deal with the basic needs in the encampment itself, and access to storage. And so that coordination of activities. We see a lot of times if there are sweeps of encampments, that sometimes what is taken away is seen as maybe debris ends up also being really important documentation that the person would have to acquire again, or other forms of personal belongings that then breaks down that level of trust when you want to engage with them again to someone who in order to get services one more time. The next looking is ensuring that access to shelter or housing options, providing those interim solutions, looking at the flow of not just having someone go into shelter, but eventually get into some form of permanent housing. Finding that having low barrier approach, meaning not having a lot of rules and regulations in order for people to get a safe place to sleep at night. We don't believe someone needs to earn a place to sleep, that they should have a place to sleep at night that's safe, that's secure, and you figure out whatever services they need around it and provide those services. And that has been a challenge in some areas, that the housing and services levels have not been commensurate, and they need to be in order to be successful and sustainable. And then finally, looking at developing pathways to permanent housing and supports, as I mentioned earlier. How do you move available resources? And this is, again, another way of connecting the dots with different agencies that might be working on the issue, but not talking to each other as well as we could. During COVID, we saw, especially in California, but throughout the nation, the need for non-congregate shelter as a way to mitigate the spread of the virus was something of extreme importance. And FEMA came in and did some amazing coordination work and funding to fund these non-congregate shelters. It was not necessarily happening in the past in the same way. What can we learn from that moving forward in trying to find ways to have different agencies with their budgets leverage the funding that we have towards a sustainable solution? And then finally, if and when an encampment area is cleared, how do you create a scenario or looking at the site to emphasize safety, and so that it doesn't again become a new encampment, either with people returning to it or new people addressing it? And how do we make that an open space area or infrastructure for its original purpose? So there's a lot of resources we have at USICH. I encourage people, I'm just going to put the list there. You can never read that, but Sunny will have those links for you. And this is how you can get a hold of me. We have a whole team around the country. So even though I cover California and Arizona, my team covers the rest of the United States, and we share best practices all the time. And I really hope this is the beginning of a conversation that we can continue to have into the future.